David Perry advises world-class brands on how to transform their marketing organizations through the acquisition and effective use of enterprise technology solutions. David has worked with more than 100 companies across a wide range of industries. He's driven over $125 million in new business and managed revenues. We met at the Bitcoin conference and we've been having some great conversations. Please enjoy this one. Thank you, David, for coming on.
Great to be here, Josh.
Let's start with this. What's a difficult conversation and why might somebody want to engage in one?
I think we all have many different types of difficult conversations in life. And so the one that I talk about in the book specifically is all around a deal. And much like in life and when you're working on deals, people unfortunately have a tendency to kind of shy away from difficult conversations. But in the context of the book, in the context of enterprise sales, I characterize a tough conversation, basically is anything that is, let's say it's something that's urgently need to address, right? Or it might be someone has a problem or a company has a problem, but they don't quite see it, right? So those are really the two different types of difficult conversations that I talk about in the book. So again, one is really there's a strong sense of urgency behind it, where you won't be able to get that deal done. You won't be able to accomplish what you need to accomplish. And the other one is around overcoming complacency, which, as you can imagine, in a large organization is, is something you need to do quite often in the sales cycle.
What are the main things that would stop a person from having a conversation like that?
This was the most difficult chapter for me to write in the book. I think I went through about 30 to 40 revisions at least. And it's because of that question, what is it that stops a person from having the tough conversations in the course of a sales cycle or even, in life in general? And I think that it really comes down to two things, and they're both very powerful blockers, right? One is fear, right? So you're afraid to have that tough conversation. You're afraid of the outcome. You're afraid what people might think. And so I talk about in the chapter in the book how to overcome that. But the second thing is, maybe the people just don't know when to have it, right? You don't see or you don't recognize the need for the tough conversation. So in that chapter, I diagnose those two gaps, right? One is just pure fear, you need to have it, but you're afraid to do it. But the other is that what if the person doesn't need to know they need to have that tough conversation? And I think that can come in the form of both, either if it's something that's, a real urgent need that the customer needs to solve, maybe you're shy, I don't want to upset the customer. I don't want to talk about that thing because then, maybe it will cause issues. But if you don't run towards that and diagnose the problem, it will just get bigger and bigger and bigger and snowball and become a huge problem. And same thing with complacency. It can be a very delicate conversation. If you're talking to somebody, they've been sitting in the seat maybe for 10, 15 years in, a massive multi-billion-dollar organization. And, here you are coming and saying, oh, well, hey, guess what? The sky is falling and you don't see it, right? So that needs to be handled very, very delicately. Those are, the couple things you need to keep in mind.
Something I've noticed with fears and how they stop us is we almost never have a dumb reason to stop. Usually our reasons to stop are some of the most intelligent things that we can come up with, because humans are smart. And why would you not do something that's obviously something you should do versus why should you not do something that is really complex and there's a whole lot of reasons why you shouldn't do it? How can somebody spot when there's a legitimate reason not to dive into a topic versus how can they see that it's their mind making up a complexity that is an excuse, essentially?
Wonderful question. And certainly one of the things that I was grappling with, and, what it comes down to is once you understand what you're trying to achieve, right? And if that fear is getting in the way of what you're trying to achieve, it's simply not going to work out. And I don't know why this is the case, but I've noticed this over, the course of my career, which now I guess I'm going on 20 years, is that in business, anytime you let fear drive your decision-making, you almost always, I don't think I've ever experienced getting optimal results when you let fear drive your decision-making process. And the reason is because you're paralyzed and you're looking at all these different eventualities and a negative set of different, possible outcomes, but you're not seeing the path that overcoming fear will allow you to go down. And our brains are amazing at manufacturing like all these like what if scenarios and kind of like psyching ourselves out. So you need to simply just look past that and ask yourself a question. What if fear wasn't in the way? How would I react in the situation? I think there's also the fact that overcoming fear, I also believe it's a muscle that you need to exercise every day. So like I still am fearful. Like if I'm working on a massive project or if I'm talking to the C-level of a multi-billion-dollar organization, there's definitely fear there or there's anxiety, of course. But I'm able to overcome it because I exercise the muscle every day to do something that makes me feel like a little bit uncomfortable or try to overcome my fear. And so that is another thing I think that can help people to overcome it.
In the spirit of the topic, I'm going to push into it just a little bit farther. This might be a dumb question, but I mean, back to this idea of like coming up with excuses. I'm fully on board with what you said. I mean, I totally agree. Like it's a skill set, it's a muscle, and we have to work towards that. It's like when I have something that I'm afraid of, I feel like my genius suddenly comes into play. It's like I come up with these brilliant concepts that, give me a reason to believe that I am not afraid, but I shouldn't approach this thing. Because I think this is a thing that a lot of people run into is how do you know that you're afraid? Like, let's not even go into the let's conquer fear conversation. How do you know that's the thing that's catching you?
I think it's hard to know. I mean, if you start procrastinating something and you look into the reasons why, it could be that you're fearing to get it done. And so a lot of what I talk about in the book, it's really, I'd say it's a philosophy and it's a series of themes that if you enact all of them, it will really help you in enterprise sales, but I think probably in business in general. And so if you find yourself not taking action, just look at the root cause of that, right? Maybe it's a lack of knowledge. Like I said, maybe you don't know what to do, or maybe it is fear. And so in that case, you need to be able to, take a pause and diagnose that and then overcome it.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing from you is sort of testing, like take an action to see what happens. If you're doing a
Definitely.
bunch of non-action, then moving forward into something gets you a result and you can learn whether or not it was fear. I'm running into this all the time in my life. The idea of just like simply action is better than non-action. And I think you're right where it's kind of confusing. I don't know if you can always spot it. I don't know if you can always like
Yeah,
know
maybe
what's
not.
happening in your brain. But if you go ahead and do something, then you kind of find out after the fact, oh, yeah, that was fear.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's impossible to anticipate all the eventualities. And that's one of the things that is so important, I think, in enterprise sales and any profession, really, that you're just consistently taking action and learning. I mean, there have been so many different deals that I've worked on over the course of my career where I start out and literally have no idea like where that thing is going to go over the course of time. There's so many surprises, but it's only through action and brainstorming with the team that you can get to that the end result, and with the customer too, right? So it's a highly collaborative process. It's iterative, and you can't have all the answers at the outset. The continuous action is really, really important.
So going back to the difficult conversations themselves, how much does intention matter inside of it?
Oh, I mean, yeah, that's really huge. I think, by the time you get to this part of the book, there's so many things that I've built upon, like intention, like building credibility with executives, caring about your customer, your product, the industry landscape, all these different things. So intention is hugely important. And the intent has to be to get your company and the customer to the right place, right? And as long as you're coming from that source of intent, the tough conversation will always land well. It doesn't mean people are going to be happy, right? It's not always like a happy ending, but at least people will respect and understand, where you're coming from if you have the right intent. And so that's why it's important to be very matter of fact when you have these conversations. You take emotion out of it, you just list out the facts. And again, it comes back to action. What is the action that you and the other individual or the other company, what do they need to take in order to get past this, particular sticky situation? This is more along the lines of there's like, an urgent problem that needs to be fixed. But you also hit upon the idea of like, well, what if someone doesn't really know that there's an issue there? And that comes back to more along the lines of complacency. So, you're an expert in your field, and well, probably several different fields, I guess, what you're doing. But the point is that when you talk to someone else, like you have this certain lens, this expertise, and you might be able to diagnose, let's say someone's starting out like creating content, or they're starting out in crypto, or they're starting out in all these different arenas. You might be able to see something, like they might think they're doing everything right, but you see something to fix. And so you need to approach that with education to help them change their view or expand their view. And so that's the other element of it, I believe.
Wonderful. Let's go with this. What is selling? And is it something that just happens in business, or is it something that happens all around us in life, philosophy, everywhere? What is the act of selling?
The act of selling, it's something that we all need to know about, right? And that's why when I wrote this book, I was pleasantly surprised. People outside of the world of enterprise sales were reading it, and they felt they were getting benefit from it. And I think it's because all of us sell in some regard, right? Or, maybe even every day. And it's about selling our ideas to people, maybe you're selling products and services company. But I think what I consider selling to be is a process of driving some type of decision point, after which point there's some type of value exchange. And that's really it. Like that's what I consider, selling to be, and the process of getting to that decision point and then making sure that after that's been reached and the value's been exchanged, that there's a positive experience on the back end. I think if you approach it that way, you can be successful over the long term. And it's about having that longer term mindset, right? If you just view everything like purely transactional, like, I want to get this deal done and then I'm, never going to see that person again, leads to really bad behavior. I think it has to be over a longer period of time in order to be successful at it.
I don't know if there's a story here or not, but I had to ask, what was the first thing you sold?
Oh my goodness, the first thing I sold, I'm not really sure what that was. There are so many different things I've done. It's hard to even remember like what the first thing I sold is. Maybe it's just the idea of my parents giving me some extra chocolate ice cream when I was a kid.
That's a good idea to sell. I've sold that one before.
Right.
Yeah, let's go into the backstory though. What led up to you getting to a point where you wanted to write a book? What's some of the backstory of your life?
Yeah, it's something I've always wanted to do. And when I was younger, I used to really enjoy writing. I enjoyed it in college. And then I kind of just lost track of it, right? I started my career and it was really busy and I just never had time for it. And then one of my best friends wrote a book and it became a bestseller, and he helped connect me in with a publisher based in Austin. And this was, on a work trip, right? So I met the publisher, really early in the morning for breakfast. And then, next thing I know, there was a signed contract and I was off to the races. So it was a desire that I've always wanted to fulfill, but it really did take a push from a friend in order to, get me over the line to take the action. And I put in a huge amount of effort and I'm really glad I did. It was a really great experience.
What happened before that? What got you into sales itself?
What got me into sales is it was a long journey. I started out wanting to be involved in technology. So I joined a startup, and then I saw management consultants in the company and how they would help to reshape and re-engineer the company. So I went into that for a little bit. I went to get my MBA at Cornell in order to go into strategy consulting. And then when I was in strategy consulting, what I found out that I really loved was the process of going after that next piece of business, the next engagement, or closing something that was brand new that would bring two companies together. So I really loved the sales aspect of the job. And I also was at IBM at the time, and I had firsthand experience in working with these enterprise account executives, and they seemed like they had everything figured out. And I remember thinking it was amazing. You know, these folks were dealing with some of the largest companies in the world, fixing huge problems, and they were unflappable. And so I was like, wow, like that's really something I'd love to do. So that's how I ended up going in that direction, in the direction of sales.
Going towards the next project, is that a trait of people that are into sales? Do they enjoy that like forward movement of like, I guess, quick changing from one project to the next?
Yes, for sure. People who are in sales like the idea of always, you know, being able to work on the next project, and that's exhilarating for them. Or I think other people might find that, let's say, you know, anxiety inducing, or maybe they, you know, they don't like that. But for salespeople, you know, in general, they really love it. It doesn't mean like there are so many different roles in sales. If you can find roles in sales where you're working with the same client for a very long period of time, it can be rapid fire, you know, project oriented, or it can be over the long term. But I say in general, yeah, salespeople definitely appreciate that element of the role. Yeah.
Who are some of your favorite companies that you've worked with?
I mean, I've worked across so many different industries. I'd say I've probably worked with, you know, maybe 100 of the top companies in the world over the past 20 years. As I've gotten to know each industry I've worked in, I found wonderful things about each of the industries that I've worked in. And so that includes financial services, consumer packaged goods. And I'm assuming that, you know, for your audience, that means like, you know, the stuff you buy at the supermarket, right? Then, you know, healthcare, electronics. I've even did a little bit in the defense industry, a lot of different industry subgroups. And what I found is that once you dive into the industry, it helps you understand the companies within that industry. And so I don't know if I really have a favorite company, but I've worked with so many. I mean, I guess I can name outside of the companies I work for, which I absolutely love. I'd say I thought SAS was amazing. They are an enterprise technology company based in Raleigh, North Carolina. The Google founders actually flew into SAS headquarters to meet with Dr. Goodnight, who's the CEO of SAS, in order to build the culture or emulate the culture that SAS had at Google back in the early days. So they're a really amazing company. I had a wonderful time meeting with executives at Nestle, all the different groups. So they're, again, a huge EPG. You know, when you look at healthcare, I mean, so many different companies. And in financial services, working with the likes of, you know, say Bank of America or Citigroup, or, you know, these you know, really huge companies. So there's been so many that I've really enjoyed working with. And, you know, I learned something new. It's amazing. Even today, after working at so many different companies, I'm still learning, you know, new things at these different companies.
One of the things I've noticed, like a disconnect I've noticed with a lot of people, is a lot of people that seem to be moving towards the thing they want to move towards and doing the thing they want to do, they often are able to work with a large number of companies. And people that are a little bit more stuck, it feels like a larger leap. It feels like some people believe in this sort of graduated process to get where they want to go. And those people tend to move a little bit more slowly. And then others seem to be able to just step from one place to another with ease. And I think there's a little bit of both in every aspect of life, right? To me, this is like actually like a learning concept of like, you need a place in learning for intuitive leaps or just stepping from one place to another, and a way to take something that's, say, hard for you and piece by piece, put it into your brain, put it into your skill set, you know, maybe add a little bit of rote learning into that. But there seems to be this sort of almost like two camps. You've very successfully gotten to this capability where you can, you know, feel comfortable going where you want to go. What are the traits that make it possible for somebody to do that? And how does a person like move towards that, where they can look at something and say, hey, that's doable, as opposed to feel like they have to go through a period of steps that may be arbitrary and maybe not? Does that question make sense?
Of course, I think that's a wonderful question. And that's what I talk about in the second chapter of my book, where you ramp up on industry leaders and technology. And the interesting thing about that question you just asked is not only does it relate to helping people to be confident in moving in new directions, but it's also at the critical point of being able to build credibility with executives, very senior level executives at, these huge companies. So what I mean by that is that, and I think where this really came together for me was even after business school was when I was doing strategy consulting. So doing strategy consulting, like I mentioned, I've worked across so many industries in such a short period of time with such a different variety of customers, it's almost hard to comprehend in retrospect. And then you're just like thrown in the room and you're like, okay, well, now you have to advise this company on, how are they going to go to market with plasma or these different plasma screens, and what sizes should they use, and what's that manufacturing process look like, and how do you ramp up on that? And so I guess the point is that I was able to figure out like how to ramp up on industries pretty quickly as a result of being in strategy consulting. And so what I try to give the reader in this book is I try to give them the notion that, yeah, you can ramp up on an industry pretty quickly. And here's how. So I talk about the different leaders in the technology arena. I talk about my experience at Adobe, Amazon, Google, and IBM, all massive technology companies, very different approaches. And I recommend like trying to just stay on top of those companies will help you to understand where technology is going. And technology, and I've said this for literally 15 years at least now, like everything is becoming technology. And so if you understand where those companies are going, you will have a framework to understand the forces that are changing just about any industry, any and every industry. And then you look at what is a leader in whatever industry you want to see. So I mentioned Nestle, right? Like maybe it's consumer packaged goods, right? So you follow that company and see what they're doing. What are they buying? How are they branding? Like what are they divesting? What are they acquiring? And everything I just mentioned, you can do that in an afternoon. So you can ramp up much more quickly. And that will then give you the confidence and the ability to go in new directions, right? Make new contacts and go down different pathways. So did I answer your question and how that works?
Yeah. At the beginning, you kind of talked about building up a skill set that is built up enough that it's applicable in different places. That's kind of what's been in my mind as well. I've been framing this in the context of like a construction worker. So if you go to a house and you get a job as a construction worker on houses and you start sweeping floors, and then a grumpy older guy says, all right, we're going to start learning how to do some drywall, right? So you learn a little bit of drywall. Then eventually, somebody takes you under their wing and says, all right, let's learn tile work. We build up this set of skills, right? And you do enough of this and you work hard. Pretty soon now, okay, you're running a team. You're running a team on the work site. Then you become the foreman, and maybe you're, looking over the entire site. And you're there every day figuring all of that out and leading a bunch of people. You develop a lot of skills. If you quit at that point, then the next job you go to, you have to start sweeping floors again. But if you were to wait like some slight amount of time more, like in comparison to how much you've done so far, pretty soon you're driving from site to site. At that point, you can get a management job almost anywhere. How does one figure out whether or not to do a vertical move or a lateral move?
That's an amazing question. I mean, in order to make, a lateral versus vertical, like the people that are making the vertical moves have two things, right? They are obviously, proficient in what they're doing, right? They've reached a level of proficiency where they can go to the next level. Well, the other thing that might not be as obvious is that they want to make a commitment to that specific vertical. And that's, really scary for some people, right? And that's actually one of the things I love about sales, where, I talk about what are some of the great reasons why anyone would want to go into enterprise sales. What makes it a great career? And the notion of portability is one of those things where you can make a ton of lateral moves and have a wonderful career. You don't need to be the CEO, although a lot of CEOs do come from sales. You don't need to be the CEO in that career. So in terms of a lateral move, if you want to continue to round out your skill set and you really enjoy the role, that's a wonderful reason to do the lateral moves, right? Or there's some other company that excites you. Actually, for your listeners, that's probably one of the best ways. I'm assuming that you have a lot of listeners that are starting out in their careers. If you find something that you like to do, you do that, and then you make a lateral move. Making that lateral move is your best bet to get into that top company, like a Google or an Amazon or whatever it is, or an Adobe, whatever it is that you want to join. And that's because you've proven proficiency in that specific role. Whereas if you just try to go right after those companies, like right out of the gate, it's going to be a lot harder, potentially, right? So that's kind of how I think about lateral versus vertical. And I have conversations, I feel like, every week or at least every other month with colleagues and others around, this exact topic. So it's something I've thought a lot about.
The amount of innovation happening right now is absurd, right? The amount of progress is utterly ridiculous. And I find myself all the time getting either A, overwhelmed with the number of options for things for me to study, research, catch up on, or B, going down a rabbit hole where it's like, maybe I didn't need to go down that rabbit hole.
Right.
There's a lot of rabbit holes, and rabbit holes are good, but maybe I didn't need to go down that rabbit hole. How do you stay up on technology in a, let's say, efficient way? What are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. I mean, I think it's a big part of what I do. And in my role in enterprise sales, I could be working on something where it could literally take 10 lifetimes to be able to understand like each of the different components of what I'm pulling together. And so if you really do want to stand, and I think it's incumbent upon everybody to try to stay on top of the trends. And so the way to do that efficiently is, I think, by finding that one technology leader that you're going to commit yourself, or maybe two or three, right? So I mentioned Adobe, Amazon, and Google. I strongly believe that if you follow those three companies and see how they're innovating, what are they doing on the margin? What are they looking at next? You will have a much better sense of how to prioritize all the other noise that's coming around in the marketplace, right? Because you can go down in, like you said, an infinite number of rabbit holes. And not only that, you could gain a glimpse into new trends and new industries that are being formed because these companies have the ability to invest and open new markets and create new products at scale and with unbelievable speed. So that's one way to do it efficiently. The other way, I think, is by using some type of framework. And so I talk a little bit about that, later in the book, but also in this particular chapter, like maybe you want to understand technology as it relates to sales. So there's something called the Luma landscape, where you have, let's say, 300 companies that are put into a single framework, and they're kind of chunked up into, let's say, 10 different areas in different aspects of sales. This way, you have a way of thinking about where is technology as it relates to sales going, and you can see that and understand it really quickly. So I think those are some of the hacks that can help you as you're trying to get into a new industry. So that's how I do it. But I do think it's also important, as you mentioned, to go down the rabbit hole and see, what does that even mean? Like, what does that entail? So within your specific area, whatever it is you're doing, your chosen vocation, go really deep, at least a few of the technologies that are critical to that arena, because this way that will help you then understand new technologies as you see them, because you'll have a solid mental framework for understanding how different technologies work together and how they can relate to your field.
Yeah, and if you're a person that's prone to rabbit holes, I think starting with the industry leaders is a really great way to go as well, because it's fairly safe to find yourself down a rabbit hole if you've started there. That's kind of what I did in the crypto space. Crypto is absurdly big already. It's just, there's so much there. And it's like, how do you make sense of any of it? Just start with Bitcoin. Because if you dive into that, then it's a way far enough a leader, that any rabbit hole you go down there is going to give you some insight into anything else you want to touch.
There's something huge happening here. I don't frankly understand everything, but again, 20-year career focused on technology. I've never seen anything like this. It seems like it's so fundamental, and the topics are so broad when people have conversations about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And I mean, It's like it touches on creativity, machine learning, the environment, money, government. I mean, it's an absolutely wild arena. And actually, if I ever come out with the second edition for this book, I will definitely put that in there. That's like one of the things
Yeah.
to keep track of for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. It seems like there's a fundamental, I think you said fundamental shift. Yeah, I keep coming back to this idea of like nature and environment. There are some things that feel like they're not really a part of the environment, they're just sort of objects in it. And then there are other things that are the environment itself. And we behave a bit differently around those two things. The things that feel like they just are the environment, we have to have sort of a degree of radical acceptance of it, like the weather, it'll destroy us, We have to like just see it for what it is, accept it and deal with it, and if we do, we can thrive. And then objects within the environment, you can kind of take it or leave it. Some of them are useful. You're out in the jungle and there's a knife, that'd be handy. But it's like you don't need every object of interest that goes your way. To me, what's happening in cryptocurrency is like the environment. It feels like an environmental shift.
Completely agree. Yeah, I think it should definitely be added towards this, pantheon of being able to understand the technology environment and landscape. And then the other thing that I should have mentioned, which I mentioned in the book as well, is there's this fellow called Ray Kurzweil. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but he wrote a book really, really far out there. It's called The Singularity is Near. And he talks about how technology changes and how it's changing exponentially. And he found something called, he calls it the law of accelerating returns. And he went back and analyzed technology all the way back to the 1890 census through to today. And he found that information technology is expanding at an exponential rate through war and peace, economic boom and depression. And he's been able to chart and predict things. He predicted when the first computer would win a Jeopardy, when the first computer would win a chess, right? And so I think that that's another really important framework to understand. And you talk about how fast things are coming. It's like the change that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be equal maybe what happened in the last 30 or 40. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to put my finger on it, but you feel it yourself, right? Like, I cannot believe the things that I'm seeing that are emerging in hard tech, in software, Bitcoin is a great example. It's just like industry that's just like exploded like overnight and can potentially change so many different aspects of how we do commerce, like how we store value, how we exchange information, how things are tracked. I mean, it's really wild. So I think that's another thing that, I would advise.
It's both terrifying and beautiful. I see a lot of people predicting, dystopian futures. A lot of people predicting utopian futures. It's like, we're going to go this way. We're going to go that way. And I find myself kind of thinking, wait a second. No, that's not what's going to happen. Variability is going to increase. Like tech in general increases variance, right? So we are going to have pockets of, wild utopian life and pockets of horrific dystopian life. We're going to have all of the above. It's going to just increase variance, and part of it's going to be horrible, part of it's going to be wonderful. But overall, to me, that's the future we want. We don't want a lesser future with less variance. Like, we want a life that's more interesting. So it seems to be happening. I feel grateful to be living when I'm living. I think it's amazing. So you've done some amazing things. Your track record of the companies you've worked with and the things that you've done, and then you decided to write a book. And currently having the first draft of a book in the bag, I can attest, books are hard.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Books are hard. You've gone down this road farther than I, and you've done it very well. And you maintained your work while doing so. How did you manage to keep everything together while doing all that?
A lot of luck. And the thing is that when I made the decision to write the book, and it's funny because when I tell people this story, they're like, "Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't like that story, like how you did that." but it really was. It's just I made a decision. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be alive for, knock on wood, hopefully, 80 years plus, let's say, right? And I'm just going to give away a couple of years, and I'm going to, work on my job, which is incredibly intense, and I'm going to write a book, on the side. And so I gave up my, I just gave up. One way of looking at it is I sacrificed my, my nights and weekends, and even like a vacation or two to work on the book, right? And I did that over the course of about 2 years. I could have done it maybe in 1 year, but I went with the flow, and it worked out really well. In hindsight, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice at all. It feels like I, was doing something that I enjoyed, and it was just a different way of spending my time. And I'm really grateful that I did it. But when people hear about it, they're like, oh yeah, I don't want to give up my nights and weekends. That's how it went. And I was also very strict, right? Like without exception, I never worked on the book during, during business hours, right? I would make sure, because I had total separation, and I would let my work take up whatever space it needed. And then once that was done, then I would, just relax and then flip to the book. And I thought that was, really, helpful way of doing it. Because if I would have tried to work on the book during business hours, I think my job would have suffered big time. And I think the book would have suffered as well.
I think sacrifice is the right word. And I think when we do it voluntarily, it makes it the most likely for it to not feel like a sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
I think it's one of those weird, you go ahead and do it, and then it's not that. A lot of people want to do that, and a lot of people are even willing to do it. I know a lot of
Right.
people that are willing to do this. I grew up in the art world, right? And
Mhm.
you can say all you want about artists, but the one thing you can't say is that they're not passionate. Like that's the wrong claim to make about artists, right? You usually can't claim either that they don't want to do something great in the world. Like usually that's there, right? And I think one of the major dangers is burnout. So you managed to do
Yeah.
this thing. How did you keep the burnout from happening?
I don't hit the reader over the head in the book per se, but it's one of the core elements, and I'll talk about that in a second. But at least for myself, with the process of writing the book, I set my expectations low, right? If I would have said, okay, this book has to be a bestseller, everybody has to read it, I need to be on, Good Morning America every other day, that would have led to burnout for sure. So I tried to have a very humble and realistic set of goals. And so that was one element of avoiding burnout. But the other was the focus of the book. So I wrote this book specifically for one person. And what I mean by that is I wrote it for someone, let's say they're 24, 25, pretty recently out of school, and they want to go into sales or enterprise sales, and they just want something that's going to help get them to the next level, right? That's going to give them some juice to help them like amp up their game. And by doing those two things, it just kept me motivated. And anytime I was like, I got lost, I was like, am I speaking to that individual? Yes or no? No? Okay, don't talk about it, right? Is it going to be helpful to that individual? No? Don't talk about it. So it was a great forcing function to stay focused and avoid burnout.
I think that's so valuable. What you're saying, in a way, I mean, this is my translation, is another type of sacrifice. So, like, you made it personal, speaking to an individual, which allowed you to sacrifice anything that wasn't appropriate for that person. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because otherwise I would have been in danger. So let's say if I was trying to talk to experienced individuals, right? People that have been doing it for a long time, I would have been at a level that would have been, incomprehensible, I think, for people that were a bit earlier on in their career, not because they're not smart, but because they don't have the shared experience to be able to understand and visualize some of the things I was talking about. So by making those sacrifices and those choices, it ironically, or paradoxically, maybe is a better word, opened up a much wider audience, which I was really surprised by, right? So I found out that people that are starting out in sales, like they appreciate it, right? And so I'm fortunate enough to be able to talk to incoming classes at my current company of, new sellers, and, they enjoy the book. But also I found that experienced people like myself enjoyed it. And then even, different leaders, executives, and people outside the industry, because it had that focus, and that really helped. And, once I finished it, I realized that it was actually kind of like, maybe it was the book that I wanted to have early in my career that would have helped me, tremendously.
There's absolutely a parallel in the art world to this of the reason why the burnout occurs there is artists want to make everything, right? Artists want to
Yeah.
make everything they possibly can make. And it's really funny or sad, everything that's sad is also funny. Everything that's funny is also sad. Artists look at, other successful artists and see them making something similar over and over again. And they blame it on capitalism. They go, "Oh, it's the capitalist machine. You have to, it forces you to release the product, right?" And it's like, okay, maybe there's some of that because it is a business. You do have to deliver stuff, sure. But also, we're not that smart. We're not that capable. We're very easily, just flattened like into just a deflated balloon by trying to do too many things in too many directions. And I think a lot of the people in the art world that succeed have managed to create art that managed to express what they want to express. And it's what I would basically call just enough. I think making something that is enough is super underrated.
Yes. And the thing is that I think it's really scary for people to make the choice or to choose that specific focus. And they feel like they're really limiting themselves, but actually they're
Yes.
setting themselves free by
Yeah.
putting a set of constraints around themselves to explore a certain avenue. And, a couple things come to mind that are, I've done a lot of travel recently, and I like to go into galleries and so forth, right? To see different things in different places. I think gives you a really good connection to the community in which you're visiting. And I remember I saw this wooden bowls and cups, and they were inlaid with turquoise and silver and maybe gold. And I remember thinking they're really beautiful, and that somebody decided, like, I'm going to spend my entire life on this particular thing, and they're selling this gallery for like thousands of dollars. And I'm sure that person is very successful. And that is just one example. I mean, there are hundreds of examples of that, right? Of just finding this, like, and committing yourself to this one specific niche. That's like the hourglass, right? You start out with a really big expanse. You try to understand, where do you want to go? And then you refine, narrow down, and you get very focused, and you can expand back out again. Should you choose to do that into other areas with that one piece of expertise, and maybe you do that several times over, over the course of your life as well.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle for me as well. I mean, I am also the artist. I am also super open personality, creative, bouncing from thing to thing. I've moved forwards in that area, and it's been such an accomplishment for me. It's improved my life in absurd ways to set those limitations. But I still have a long ways to go. Do you have any thoughts on how one can narrow their field of focus? I mean, I think there's always a sacrifice that comes with it, and I think there's always a little
Yeah.
pain that comes with it. But how can someone do it in a way that feels more right, if that makes sense?
It definitely makes sense. I think we have to talk about something specific to see it. So let's say if you want to become an artist, right? The way to do it is by trying a lot of things, or maybe, as related to enterprise sales, you work for all these different companies and you find out what you really love. And then you have to make that commitment to it. But I don't think it's something that happens overnight, right? I think you have to understand that it's a journey. It can take years.
People that try to niche early destroy themselves. I could be wrong, but at least for people on the creative end of the personality spectrum, I think that people that try to do it too early run into a lot of issues. I like what you said about what you want. I think desire is a critical factor in all of it, where the more tapped into it, the more reward you're getting out of the thing you're chasing. So the less painful dropping everything else feels.
Exactly. There's really no pain if you have a strong enough desire and you're focused in the right way. What becomes painful is, like, if that desire becomes mitigated for whatever reason, or if it becomes dulled, and if that focus starts to, shift. That's where, the pain can come. But of course, there are lots of reasons that could happen. But if you're able to maintain those things, you'll be okay. And But I think it also comes down to, we're talking about focus and sacrifice, but it comes down to expectation as well. Like, what do you expect out of what you're doing? If you expect the world, then you're going to be disappointed, right? And it can take a long time. You're also talking about the concept of mastery, I think, right? Where, you have to build over time. And then the other point you mentioned was around, you think that if people become too niche-y too early on, that's a mistake. And I totally agree, because if you become too niche-y, like, too focused on a niche, like right off the bat, you lose the ability to think across different disciplines and then being able to apply them to break through different plateaus in whatever it is you're doing. And, I think that's a real shame. Hopefully nowadays, I mean, there's so much available. There's so much wonderful information available at your fingertips that you can explore either through, the traditional schooling system, or through, educating yourself through podcasts like this and other venues online. You can get a pretty well-rounded, understanding of the world in different disciplines and what you might like to pursue.
I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned sort of lowering the bar, lowering expectations. That idea of lowering expectation, I also think, is just incredibly important. And I have a bit of a pet peeve in the, let's call it the motivational arena of the world, where it's very popular to dream big. It's very popular to say, shoot for the stars, maybe you'll hit the moon. Stuff like that. And
Yeah.
first of all, whoever made that phrase up was not very into physics, I don't think. But
That's
but
funny.
I want to share something in my experience, and I want to see how you connect to this idea. I had a lot of struggles to launch in my process of getting this adulthood thing going. And one of my big ones was actually, I think, my dreams. I had such big dreams that they were oppressive. They would tear me apart. And also, I was nothing like my dreams. Like, I was so far removed from the things that I wanted to become that it was a little absurd. I mean, this is common when you have like the talented kid that gets complimented, 3 too many times. And it's told, oh, you're going to do great things in life. When you get older and you do the adulthood thing, you go, oh crap, I have to actually do them now, right? And usually those people fall flat on their face. So I fell flat on my face. I talk about this a lot with people, and I don't think I've come up with the best way to word it, but basically what I say is I gave up on my dreams. And people hear that and they think, oh my God, that's terrible. And I'm like, no, I didn't give up on them in the sense that I thought they were impossible or that they would never ever happen. I didn't give up on them in a fatalistic sense of, oh, I'll never achieve that. I gave up in the sense of, I'm not that person that can do that thing. At least, maybe not ever, definitely not now. That's not a thing I can do.
Right.
And through that process, it was very painful, but it enabled me to look at myself and see what I was and go, hey, what could you do? What could you do? And, that was the point when I started making more payments on my student loans and, getting my life together and like doing little things here and there. And what I noticed was anytime before that, for me to, like, I was really struggling with debt. That's why I mentioned the student loans. Like, anytime before that, for me to put a little bit extra on my student loans felt pathetic. It felt like, you dumb imbecile, you want to achieve this big dream here, and you're just paying an extra $50 this month, like so it would actually feel bad to move forwards because I would compare it to this, like, I can't think of a better word than oppressive dream that I would have of who I wanted to be. And then when I let go of it, I actually then started moving forwards, and the dream started to become possible, actually. And what I find myself talking to people now about is, could you operate under the premise that if you were a fully functional human, you would go ahead and move towards your dreams? Like, that would happen. You don't need to have like the big dream of this massive achievement in your mind all the time to get there. You actually need to be fully functional and work on what you can work on. And it's a thing that I'm still working on communicating. I'm still working on shaping as a thing to talk about, but it's had a really big impact on my life. And to
Yeah.
me, that concept of lowering the bar is connected to that idea. And I'm wondering how you resonate with that. And has that played
Yeah.
out in other parts of your life? Has that been a factor in how you've seen the world at all?
Absolutely, it has. You know, you have to take care of the basics, right? You have to make sure that you're well-rounded and you're functioning, because otherwise everything else is impossible. If you haven't done that, then, you know, forget about everything else. And the other notion of, you know, dream big, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with having big dreams, but you need to be satisfied. Or let's say, you know, for my book, for example, right? It's been much more successful than I would have ever expected. But had it not been, I would have been totally fine and very happy, and it would have been worth the effort. So I think it's almost like you have this line, right? And you say, okay, I'm starting here from zero, and maybe 5 paces away is, you know, I'll be happy if I get here. So you get yourself moving, you get that momentum towards that direction. And if you hit that big goal, you know, great. If you don't, you know, no biggie, right? But you've gained so much along the way of getting to that point. And I've experienced that myself over and over again. It's, you know, from getting into college, playing Division I lacrosse, you know, getting to Google, getting into the NBA, writing this book, like, you know, every year, like working on these different deals and hitting my number. It's like you take the steps and you try to go, and like, yeah, it's okay to have that big dream, but you have to set your expectations in the right place, right? So let's say, you know, you shoot for the moon and you come a little short of that, and maybe you crash land in the ocean a couple times. So that's okay. And just like, you know, swim back to shore and start again.
Yes. So let's dive into another topic. It's near and dear to my heart, something that you've talked about quite a bit. So frameworks. So why do frameworks matter?
Frameworks are so important. And the reason why I talk about them in the book is because I think that as salespeople, we're very much focused on action, getting out there, talking to the customer. But the frameworks kind of get forced upon us by management to say, do things in this way via this framework, right? And so I wanted to make sure that by talking about frameworks, that salespeople are actually motivated to take advantage of them. And the reason why they're so important is because they amplify thought and they refine action, and they will propel you in the right direction to be able to accomplish things that are far beyond what you might have expected as you put in consistent thought energy and consistent action, you know, into a specific framework. And so, you know, I give a couple examples, like, you know, one is the adaptation of the flywheel that Jeff Bezos used and actually credits with the formation and every big decision he's made at Amazon. And so I put that out there to see, like, and this is for your listeners as well, like, if a framework is something that, you know, is good enough for Jeff Bezos and he can make a couple, you know, $1 trillion company out of it, like, you know, maybe you should take it seriously, right? But the way it works for you, right? Like maybe there's some type of framework that you can apply to your podcast that will, you know, make sure you're hitting, and I think you're kind of doing that, right? Hitting all the different topics, and like, this is the cadence and like how you want to get off your podcast. But in sales, it's these sales methodologies. And so one I talk about, which I think is great, is the value prompter. It's not something I came up with. It's another company that came up with it. But it's like, if I was in sales for, let's say, like 40 years, and I want to come up with a simple framework that will make sure to analyze deals, you know, what would it be? And it would probably be the value prompter. And the reason why that thing is so valuable is because as an individual salesperson, you can think through that framework and deconstruct your deal and find areas of weakness or softness in your deal to eliminate risk, make sure you're delivering value to the customer, make sure you have a plan to get through to, you know, an actual close, and they distill it down to a mathematical formula, which I think is brilliant. And it's like, if you have a 0 in any one of the areas, in other words, you have a gap in any one of the areas in the value formula, it equals 0, right? So let's say you're great in every area except for one, no deal, right? So it's a way to kind of qualify. But the other thing that's brilliant about that is that it enables you as a salesperson to talk about your deals in a way with your team in a very methodical and quick way. So you know that you've gone through all the different facets of the deal, and you can do that in 5 minutes with management instead of like a meandering, wandering discussion over the course of an hour that you're kind of lost by the end of it. So frameworks are incredibly powerful. So I encourage, everyone that's listening to this, and no matter what field they're in, to evaluate the frameworks that are applied to their field, take them very seriously, apply them, test and iterate, find what works, find when it's important to use them, when not, and try to create your own even, right? And so that's what that chapter is about in that book. And I think it's really, really important.
Would you say that a mental framework is, I guess, two ideas come to mind. One is like a mental equation. And then the other would be, would you say it's something like a mental conception of how like a subset of the world is, and then that gives you the capability to attach the rest of the world to it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's all those things. I mean, the way I like to think about frameworks is like they're just out there, right? They exist in nature. And I think one of the more famous ones is the Boston Consulting Group Growth Matrix, right? Where it's a 4x4 and you always want to be in the upper right-hand quadrant. You can apply that to many different ways. Like if Boston Consulting Group didn't come up with that, I'm sure that somebody else would have, right? So I think they're just things that exist out there and you can find them. And I do agree. I think they're equations. I think they're diagrams. I think they're, mental models of the world. I think they're, all those different things. And they're really, really helpful in a variety of arenas. And so I talked about, what could be for podcasts. If you're doing consulting, you have to be good at frameworks because you're basically delivering recommendations in the form of different types of frameworks and different lenses of thought and action that company you're advising can adopt. Same thing with sales. You're applying frameworks to how you're conducting yourself, but also to potential recommendations you're giving to your customers. So I think no matter what you do, you're being governed by frameworks, either explicitly or even if you don't realize it, right? They underpin your worldview and how you conduct yourself.
Yeah, I agree. They're all over the place. My book is on a framework. There's like a random one that pops into my head is that the quadrants of urgent, important, urgent but not important, etc., etc. Such a good one. And then like nomenclature. Nomenclature is a mental framework. Like if you don't know anything about Latin and you try to learn the Latin name of a bird, you're not going to remember it. Except for one. I just think it's funny. Do you know the Latin name of an inhinga?
Inhinga?
Anhinga.
No, I don't. I don't know.
That's the Latin name.
Oh, okay.
The Latin word for anhinga is anhinga, which I find immensely amusing for some reason. But yeah, it's like if you know a little bit about it and you understand that, families of species have similarities in all of their names, then, very quickly you can, spot a bird and hear the Latin name and realize, okay, it's part of this family. And the weird part about that is you will remember the bird more clearly. I think that's fascinating. It's not just this like separate understanding in this framework. It allows the brain to integrate the new information. Just for the sake of an example, could you go into, you pick the Bezos example you said, or the, what was the name of the other one?
Well, I talked about the PCG matrix, but to make sure I'm speaking exactly to what you're talking about, there's something called the Minto pyramid principle. And I think one of those foundational consulting methodologies and frameworks. But what it makes me think about is like, let's say you abstract down, you make it even simpler than that. And the notion is that our brains think in hierarchies. So you have a single idea at the top and you decompose it to a set of, let's say, another 2, 3, 4, 5 ideas, and you deconstruct those down another level, right? Your ability to articulate that concept will increase exponentially because you'll see the levels of, let's say, either causality or meaning or what have you as you go down those different levels. And so that's a really powerful way to conduct conversations, deliver recommendations to customers. So an example might be, I want to increase revenues. Okay, well, how am I going to do that? A, B, and C. And then how does A, B, and C happen, right? Like, so if you can articulate that, and so I give an example of that in the book, right? It's immensely powerful, and that enables you to then have really concise conversations with executives in the course of a pitch, or in the course of delivering recommendations to your customers.
And I imagine that would help with the tough conversations that we opened with at the beginning.
Definitely. Yeah, it would.
Yeah. Let's talk about the dark side of sales.
So the dark side of sales, I'm laughing because like when I see now that I'm a bit removed from having completed the book, like it sounds like, is that something unsavory, or, is that about like lying or cheating customers, or, no, like not at all. Like to me, like I just assume that everyone's smart enough to know that they shouldn't be doing that, right? And because you're never going to be successful in the long term if you conduct yourself in that way. So what I consider the dark side of sales to be is really about finding yourself in certain circumstances, or like, things are happening and you react badly to them, right? And it gets you into this really negative headspace. And that is the dark side of sales. And so by talking about this specific chapter, I give the reader a lot of different examples of some of the curveballs that are going to be thrown at them, over the course of their career. So they can be, and again, it comes back to expectations, right? So they can expect them and know that they're coming. And this way, when they get hit, it's not going to knock them off their feet. They're ready to roll with the punches. I also talk about the importance of focusing on gratitude when you get into this like negative headspace. There's something really magical about that. It's not like, all the time, but if you write down, let's say you're in a bad place and you write down something, in the morning, let's say just for a week, like 1, 2, 3 specific things that you're grateful for, it just totally shifts your mindset and you're able to function much, much more effectively. So that's what the dark side of sales is about. And it's amazing because working for these top companies, I think it's safe to say that the best salespeople at these top companies are among the best salespeople in the world. Isn't that a reasonable thing to suggest, right? But yet I can still see that sometimes they're caught in this, like the dark side of sales, right? But the difference between them and let's say some of the others is that it'll be very momentary and fleeting. So they catch themselves, they snap out of it, and they're off to the next thing. And so that's what I'm trying to help the reader do with this particular chapter.
Could you give me an example of one of the curveballs that might happen, how that might turn into a spiral,
sure.
and how someone might come out of it?
For sure. And this is something that's very common if you're going to be, either in a startup or at one of these larger companies. It's the mergers and acquisitions, right? So imagine you're going into work, everything's great. You have your next 6 months planned out. You're going here on vacation. You think you have great relationships with all your coworkers. Oh, surprise, we've been acquired. Or, oh, hey, we're acquiring this company. Your job is totally different now, right? Like that can be very, very jarring for people if you don't see that coming. And so people can fall down into a pretty dark spiral. Like, oh, well, my job is changing. Like, I don't know if I want to go in that direction, or, I don't know, what about all these new people that are coming in? Are they going to take my job? And so it can become a downward spiral very, very, very quickly. And the other thing is you can be resistant to change. Like, oh, I don't want to do things in that new way. I like the way that I was doing things before. And so you kind of resist the change. So that is the downward spiral, right? You try to fight some type of massive, because guess what? If you're trying to fight some type of like corporate action where they're bringing two huge companies together, like it's not going to work, right? It's not going to work out for you because you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to go in a different direction than management's decided to, and bring these companies together. So rather than fighting change, you can become an example of what the future is that management team is striving for. So if you can do that and help the company through those changes and through the paces of change, then that is how you come out of it, and that's how you win. And the people that get caught in that spiral, maybe they'll leave the company, right? And that creates more opportunity for the people that stay behind, stick it out, and drive to that new vision and that new direction.
Is that spiral addictive?
Not only is it addictive, but it's also contagious. And what I mean by that is that you can hear people talking negatively about the acquisition, or it could be like anything. That's just one of the examples. And you really want to try to stay away from that, if you can, right? You want to hear it, right? Because it could be a canary in the coal mine, but you have to be really careful not to get sucked into it, I think. And just think of it objectively.
Let's transition from that dark spot to something I like a lot. Value. What is hidden value?
That's one of my favorite topics. And so the way I start off that chapter is with a quote from Galileo. And he basically says something to the fact of like, even with scant exploration, the cloak is, reveals the mysteries that lie underneath, right? And the reason why I think that's so powerful is that when you're in sales or probably lots of different walks of life, you might have your own, and this also comes down to frameworks, you might have your own mental model of like what value is to the customer, but the customer is thinking about something totally different. And if you don't talk that out, if you don't explore, if you don't have your own criteria of, or, set of ideas or hypothesis as to what is valuable, and you don't communicate that to the customer and give them a chance to react, you're not going to be able to uncover, what I call hidden value or capture hidden value. So it's the simple notion of collaborating with your customers and understanding, how do they think about value and how do they translate something like return on investment, right? That's a, huge buzzword, right? But what the hell does that mean? And what are the underlying assumptions that customer has? If you're not speaking to those, then you're not going to be able to have a good outcome.
Yes, I was going to ask you what creates value, but it sounds like kind of what you're saying is learn how to communicate to understand what they believe creates value. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I think that's the first step and the most fundamental step. But there's also the notion of growing the pie or expanding value and creating it, like you were saying. So the way that works is, I give a few examples, but I think, two are pretty powerful. And the first idea is going outside your role, right? So let's say you're focused on selling, right, a certain product, but if you're not engaged in helping your customer solve their problems, even if it's a little bit outside of your comfort zone, outside of your role, you could be missing something huge that could be immensely valuable. So I give the example where I think it was Google, right? There's an advertising sales team that was trying to get a deal done, and they threw in a freebie of some, Google Cloud services, and that ended up leading to a massive Google contract, and then up-leveling the advertising team to the C level where they themselves got a big deal. So it's like they were trading items of an equal value, and they radically expanded the pie just by going a little bit outside of their comfort zone and thinking a bit bigger. So that's, I think one of the areas. The other idea is by, simply by working with partners. And what I mean by that is, other companies that you can pull into the fold to drive value for your customer. And it could be something that, maybe there's a company that has a really innovative niche and you combine it with what you're doing and you have something completely new that solves a particular problem end to end. And it makes that, from something that's small and not very helpful to, a huge potential deal. And so those are some of the ways that you can help to expand the pie. But like I said, I think in the beginning, you have to at least have that dialogue around how does that customer think about value? Because if you don't know that, you can't then translate whatever this big idea that you have is in terms that the customer will be able to understand, and then get done through all their different committees and meetings that they have before they can move forward with a specific opportunity.
Are there some commonalities in the way people perceive value?
For sure. I think I talk about a list of things, specific things in my book, right? And so I think it comes down to what's valuable to me as an employee of this organization. I'm talking about, so let's say you're a salesperson, you're selling to a specific employee, they're thinking about what's in it for me, right? Pretty classic. But they might also be thinking about what's in it for their team, what's in it for their immediate, business unit, what's in it for their company as a whole. So I think that's one of the first prisms that they view value through. The other is simple things like time savings. Is it going to save them money? Is it going to help them with a specific problem, faster and better? Is it going to give them access to something like, maybe they want access to industry events or something along those lines? Is it going to help them overcome a new governmental regulation, right? So all these things are different sources of value. And I have a pretty long list in the book, right, that you can think through. And if you approach the problem with those set of things and talk about them, then you can understand how the customer measures them, right? So the regulatory thing is a perfect example, right? Like maybe you're assuming, oh, well, this is going to save you $100 million. The customer's like, I don't care. That's not how I'm thinking about it. It's going to save my team and I 3 months of pain, and that will allow me to cut XYZ costs. And then maybe I'll be able to get to that 100 million, but they can't even think about that 100 million in value that they're going to get. All they can see is that immediate term pain and how to get past that, right? So that's an example of why the dialogue is so important. And having that initial set of, like, I call them, value sources, right? And then you can think about, like, how can they be received and how can the customer then act on them?
What are some of the big things that somebody that's not in this field, not in enterprise sales, can take away, can learn from the field?
I think there's so much. One of the things I think is important for people that are coming up, like, let's say they want to change jobs or they want to think about their careers. One of the things they can take away is just the simple idea of, like, how to build a pipeline of opportunities for yourself. I have a chapter called Automatic Pipeline, right? And so it's about taking all the guesswork out of creating a pipeline for yourself. It sounds so stupidly simple, but it works incredibly well, right? It's the idea of putting a spreadsheet together and listing out the opportunities you're pursuing, and a simple yes or no for a checkbox. Like, are you talking to the decision maker? Are you talking to the person that can make this thing happen? And then what's the next action you take? So think about that, right? And so you have a list of those 5, 10, 15 things. Apply that to a job hunt. Apply that to building, maybe building your podcast, or apply that to enterprise sales. Like, I think that's something you can take away, and you can build a huge pipeline for yourself without having to expend too much energy. And so that's something that I've used time and time again during my job hunts to help me enjoy my job hunts, instead of, like, be like drowning in them, but also in the context of my role in enterprise sales.
Is there a message that you wanted to fit in the book, but it didn't quite fit, or you wish was in it, or that you would like to say in addition to what's there?
And not until today. This is the first day that there's been something that I was like, well, maybe I should have included that. And I'd say it's the idea of, of what's happening with Bitcoin and the blockchain and all these things. So I think that's something that I would have liked to have included. So that's something that I would have put that in chapter 2 as, like, an additional thing to consider when tracking technology.
Yeah, it's a big one. So where are you at life-wise now? What are you working on specifically now? And, like, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I really love my, my day-to-day job. Like, it's my, first, second, third priority, at Adobe. But I'm also, really enjoying, doing podcasts for the book. I enjoy investing in, early stage companies and advising early stage companies specifically with regards to enterprise sales. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm having a great time, hanging out with my wife and kid. And we just started summer preschool, so that's been pretty cool. But that's where I am now.
Wonderful. Where can people pick up the book? Where can they get in touch with you? And where do you want to send folks online?
Yeah, so people can find Game of Sales on Amazon. That's where they can pick up the book. In terms of getting in touch with me, they can connect with me on LinkedIn. So if you search for David Perry and then Adobe, I should come right up there. And I think, the one thing I hope that people take away from the book is that once they read it, I hope they take at least one thing away from the book and then they apply it, like, the very next day. So that's my hope for the book itself.
That's fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I really appreciate you coming on. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, same here, Josh. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.